Well, comrades, last session, long day. If you start nodding off, I don't blame you. I'm going to start with the Second World War, because I think that gives us some perspective for what the state of play is today. So the United States emerged from the Second World War as the greatest economic and military power on earth. The powers that lost their position as great powers were Britain, France, and the losers of the war, Germany, Italy, and Japan. France would go on to lose its imperial hold over Vietnam and North Africa. In the case of Vietnam, it handed over overlordship to the USA. Similarly, Britain was too weak to hold on to its empire. It adopted the strategy of withdrawal from east of Suez, the cover name for British interests in Asia. In 1947, Britain withdrew from India. In the same year, Britain handed over its pro-royalist military intervention in the Greek Civil War, handed over to the United States. Stalin's state capitalist Russia came out of the war as the second strongest power. At the Yalta Conference in 1945, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill carved up Europe to give Stalin territory as far westwards as Eastern Germany and Czechia. In return, Stalin held back strong communist parties in Italy, France, and Greece from revolution. In the West, international institutions dominated by the United States were set up in the late 1940s. The World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, GATT, GATT being the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and NATO. Also, the United States Marshall Plan gave billions of dollars of economic assistance to war-torn Europe. You hear a lot of rubbish from bourgeois ideologues who say that NATO was and is a force for protecting democracy. That's nonsense. Portugal, under the fascist dictator Salazar, was one of the 12 founder members of NATO. NATO supplied Portugal with military equipment, including napalm bombs, to combat national liberation movements in Portugal's African empire. Another example, Greece. Under the 1967 to 1974 military dictatorship, Greece retained its membership of NATO. At the same time as the Western Alliance was being built in the 1940s, the same process took place on the Russian side. The Warsaw Pact military alliance came into being, and the establishment of Comecon, the equivalent of GATT, IMF, etc. And so began the Cold War. Cold War ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and independence from Russia was gained by Eastern European nations. Ultimately, the Stalinist empire collapsed because its economy could not bear the weight of trying to keep up with the US military. The Russian economy was distorted by having to maintain its military-industrial complex. For a period, US imperialism had no great rival. However, despite being the only superpower, the United States imperialism went into decline. Notably, the United States had to withdraw from the Middle East. And when Putin went into Ukraine and took Crimea and the Donbass in 2014, the United States did nothing. China, however, has emerged over the last 3 decades as an economic powerhouse to challenge the dominance of the United States. China has become the so-called workshop of the world. Ironically, partly due to American firms setting up in China to exploit cheap labor. There are 2 main imperialist rivalries in the world today. First, that between the 2 superpowers, United States and China. Second, that between Russia and Eastern Europe. I will say something about the Russia-Ukraine war later on. Before that, we should take note of recent developments in the Western camp. Unexpected and radical developments have taken place since Trump returned as president on the 20th of January this year. He has proceeded to rip up the certainties of the Western alliance that had held together since the end of the Second World War. He has threatened to annex Greenland and the Panama Canal. He is waging a trade war against all comers, including against China, Europe, Mexico, and Canada, the latter to pressurize Canada to integrate into the United States as the 51st state. NATO is in tatters. For 3/4 of a century, the United States was the major contributor and dominant state in NATO. Now the United States threatens a military takeover of Greenland, a constituent part of Denmark, which is an EU member and original founder of NATO. So too is Canada, a founder of NATO. In addition to Trump's threats and trade war, he has told European states to fund their own defense against Moscow's expansionism. Trump supports the dismemberment of Ukraine and offers no guarantee against Russia taking over the whole of that country at a later date. Israel is escalating its genocidal war against Palestinians in Gaza with Trump's support politically and as an arms supplier. Israel's war aims are now to reoccupy the Gaza Strip from which it withdrew in 2005. It seems that Israel intends to expel the Palestinian population. Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war. Humanitarian catastrophe is hardly an adequate description of the suffering the Palestinians are going through. I say Trump is committing these crimes, but that is just shorthand for Trump acting as agent of the ruling class of the United States. A necessary far-right idiot has been called forth by the billionaire class to restore their lagging fortunes on the world stage, especially in competition with China. Trump's radical program of imperialist aggression abroad and war against the working class at home is not some aberrant madness. It is an expression of the United States capitalist class putting its considerable weight behind the far-right actors. The same process is happening in Europe as capitalists swing from traditional centre-right parties to the far right. We are entering a period of heightened imperial rivalries and increased military spending and preparedness. The United States' abandonment of the defense of Europe is a clearing of the decks to square up to their main rival, China. This pivot to Asia predates Trump. It began under Barack Obama and continued under Joe Biden. A significant military development has been the AUKUS agreement made in 2021 by Australia, UK, and the United States. Under AUKUS, Australia will acquire a fleet of nuclear attack submarines and provide bases for US and British nuclear submarines. The European Union is an imperialist power bloc, but it is composed of independent constituent states that are not equally powerful. The EU is dominated by France and Germany, the latter having the strongest economy, largest population, and the greatest military force. The imperialist rivalry in the region is over the domination of Eastern European states from Finland in the north to the Balkans in the south. Russian expansionism westward, beyond the Ukraine, would not be fanciful if Ukraine had not fought Russia to a standstill. Putin is following in the footsteps of the Russian Tsars and Stalin. The Russian Empire under the Tsars included Finland, the Baltic states, Poland, Bessarabia, and the Caucasus. Under the 1939 Nazi-Soviet pact, Stalin occupied half of Poland, part of Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and part of Romania. Then at the end of 1939, Stalin launched a full-scale attack on Finland, which the Finns repulsed, despite being vastly outnumbered. Who is to say that Russia will not move against its Western neighbours at some point in the future? Now, at this point, I'd like to focus a bit on the Russia-Ukraine war. From the beginning of this conflict, we, the ISO, have not been neutral, but have stood with Ukraine. I don't think we've ever revisited our position on the war. This position has been set out in 3 pieces published on our website. The first was a statement on behalf of the ISO, published just 4 days after the February 2022 invasion. We called for internationalist solidarity between Ukrainian and Russian workers. We called for the success of the anti-war demonstrations that were then taking place in Russian cities. We called for Putin to be ousted. We supported Ukraine's right to self-determination. We said that NATO had nothing to offer for the Ukrainian people. And we said that our solidarity should extend to those resisting Putin's assaults. A couple of weeks later, we published a speech in the Whanganui-a-Tara branch given by Corey Kanunen. And the third piece was an excellent article by Sarah published in July last year. The 3 pieces together are politically consistent. Reading them again, I think they have stood the test of time. Central to our position is that we support Ukraine's fight for self-determination and the defeat of the Russian aggressor. Other revolutionary socialist organizations around the world have taken the same position on the war as we have. For example, the organizations affiliated to the Fourth International and the organizations affiliated to the International Socialist League. However, parts of the international revolutionary left have taken a quite different line. These organizations include the British Socialist Workers' Party and other members of the International Socialist Tendency, the Argentinian Workers' Party, and various small sects, including the International Bolshevik Tendency. These organizations see the conflict between Russia and Ukraine as a proxy war between the United States and NATO on one side and China and Russia on the other. They do not recognize Ukraine's right to self-determination. And since most of these organizations are located in the West, they oppose NATO and arms for Ukraine on the basis that the main enemy is at home. They support the Russian camp, making the same arguments as Putin and recently Trump. For example, that NATO and Ukraine are responsible for starting the war, and that the Ukrainian government was infested with fascists. Contrary to the proxy war theory, the United States and NATO have never been unstinting in its weapons for Ukraine. They've used weapons supply for leverage over the Ukraine. Trump's plan for the dismemberment of the Ukraine, i.e. pro-Russia, blows the proxy war theory out of the water. My parting thought on imperialism today is that there is no need to be alarmist. World War III is not about to erupt because neither China nor the USA have built up their military resources sufficiently. For example, Australia's nuclear submarines, which I mentioned earlier, will take years to come on stream. Having said that, with the rise of the far right in the Americas and Europe, we're living in a more dangerous world now, and it is hard to predict what will happen next in terms of imperialist expansionism.